On the night of November 8th, 2010, 53-year-old Bic Pan and a few of her friends were learning how to line dance at a church in Toronto, Canada. Bic and her friends had been going to the dance class every week for a while, and Bic finally felt like she was getting the hang of it. Bic was average height with long black hair, and she wore workout clothes, glasses, and bright red lipstick. And while she danced, she felt her feet aching and sweat was running down her face, but she couldn't stop laughing because she was having so much fun. When the last song ended, she and her friends made their way out of the church into the parking lot. It was a mild November night for Toronto, with temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But after getting hot and sweaty while dancing, Bic felt a slight chill when she stepped outside. She and her friends laughed more as they talked about some of their least graceful moments on the dance floor. Then they all said goodnight, and they'd see each other at the church the following week for more line dancing. And Bic walked across the parking lot, got into her Lexus car, and drove off towards her house in the suburbs. And while she drove, she looked out the windshield at Toronto passing by, and she thought about what a fun night she had just had. And she felt happy and like she belonged here in Toronto. And that was a big deal for Bic, because it had taken her a long time to feel that way. Bic had come to Canada about 30 years earlier in the late 1970s when her family fled Vietnam as political refugees after the Vietnam War. She had grown up speaking Vietnamese and Cantonese, and so when she came to Canada in her 20s, learning English had been hard for her at first. And she had struggled to find work, and she didn't feel like she fit in anywhere she went. But then, Bic had reconnected with a man she had known briefly in Vietnam, Han Pan. Like Bic, Han had come to Canada from Vietnam with his family following the war, and Han had also grown up speaking Vietnamese and Cantonese. And so, when Bic and Han met in Canada, it was like they finally had someone who understood everything they had gone through. And they had quickly fallen in love and gotten married, and a few years into their marriage, they had started a family, having a daughter and then a son. And together, Bic and Han had worked hard to make money and put enough away to give their children more opportunities than they had when they were growing up. And while it had never been easy, Bic felt like she and Han had achieved that goal, because when the children were young, they had done really well in school and had participated in different extracurricular activities and had made great friends. And now that their kids were in their 20s, they were pursuing good, stable careers, and so Bic was finally giving herself a chance to relax a little and enjoy the place that had been her home for 30 years. At about 9:30 p.m., Bic pulled into her secluded neighborhood in Markham, a large suburb of Toronto, and she drove towards her house. Big two-story homes lined the streets, and the neighborhood was calm and quiet. Bic pulled into her driveway, and she noticed that most of the trees in her and her neighbors' yards had started to lose their leaves. She thought that was a shame because she loved the burst of color the changing leaves gave the neighborhood in early fall. Then, Bic opened the garage door and parked her Lexus in the garage next to her husband Han's Mercedes-Benz. Bic closed the garage door, stepped out of her car, and winced a little because her feet had gotten even more sore from her night of line dancing. Then she went inside the house and walked down a long hall into the living room. Bic's house was big, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, a basement that had been converted into a family room, and a staircase that led to 4 bedrooms on the second floor. But the prized possession in the house, at least as far as Bic was concerned, was the piano in the living room downstairs. When Bic and Han were younger, they had worked and saved to buy that piano for their daughter, Jennifer. And as Jennifer grew up, Bic and Han knew they had spent their money wisely, because Jennifer had been a gifted piano player from the time she was a little girl. And even now, at 24 years old, Jennifer still played the piano regularly and made extra money working as a piano teacher. And listening to her daughter play that piano in the living room was still one of Bic's favorite things in the world. Bic walked through the living room past the piano and slowly made her way upstairs. Her feet felt like they were pounding, so she held onto the banister to make her climb a little easier. And when she got to the second floor hallway, her daughter, Jennifer, popped out of her bedroom, smiled, and said hello. Jennifer was 5'7" tall, with black hair tied into a long ponytail, and she wore a white sweatshirt, black yoga pants, and a pair of glasses with black frames. Jennifer was about to go back to school and start classes at a nearby college to become a pharmacist, and she had lived with a friend closer to Toronto for a while, but now she'd moved back home with her parents, and she'd managed to save up a good amount of money for school from teaching her piano lessons. Bic knew Jennifer was very much a young Canadian woman who saw her Vietnamese parents as somewhat old-fashioned. But Bick hoped that she and Han had at least passed on their beliefs about working hard and saving money to their daughter. Bick and Jennifer talked to each other in Vietnamese, and Jennifer laughed while Bick recounted stories from that night's dance class, and Jennifer's laugh was infectious, so before long, Bick started laughing too. Then Bick said she wanted to get changed, so Jennifer went back into her bedroom, and Bick headed down the hall to her and Han's bedroom. When Bick walked in, Han was already drifting off to sleep in bed, but he woke up enough to say hello to his wife and ask how her dance class went. Bick said she'd had a great time and couldn't wait to go again next week, and then she changed into her pajamas, which had pictures of Winnie the Pooh on them. Then Bick told Han goodnight and walked back downstairs. She went into the kitchen, grabbed a large bowl out of a cabinet, went over to the sink, and filled the bowl with ice-cold water. Then she walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She put the bowl down in front of her on the floor, and then put her feet inside the bowl. Bick smiled and leaned back on the couch. The ache in her feet was finally starting to go away. Bick grabbed the remote off an end table, turned on the TV, and found the channel that showed Chinese news programs in Cantonese. Because as much as Bick might have finally felt at home in Canada after living there all those years, she still enjoyed ending her nights by watching the news in one of her first languages. Then Bick heard footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned and saw her daughter, Jennifer, walking into the living room. Jennifer headed towards her mother on the couch, but then suddenly stopped cold. Jennifer turned and looked out one of the living room windows to the street in front of the house, like she saw something that she couldn't quite make out. Then she walked to the front door and looked out the small window on it, and she leaned in close to try to get a better look. Bick turned away from the TV and asked her daughter if everything was okay, and Jennifer, who now had a chance to see what was out there, realized that what she had seen outside was just a car parked across the street. So she stepped back from the door and told her mom that, you know what, everything's fine, it's just a car. Then Jennifer said goodnight to her mom and headed upstairs. Bick turned back to the TV, and as she watched the news, she stretched out a little more on the couch, and she felt like this was the perfect end to her day. At almost 10:15 p.m., about 45 minutes after Bick had gotten home, she was still downstairs soaking her feet and watching the Chinese news. And Jennifer was lying in bed in her room upstairs. Her room was filled with Jennifer's college textbooks that she had marked up with notes over the years, and she knew when she went back to school soon to pursue her career as a pharmacist, she'd have to start hitting the books again. But she still had a couple of months before classes started, so she wasn't thinking too much about school yet. Instead, she had spent most of the night just texting with some friends and with her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong. Jennifer and Daniel had dated for years, going back to their time in high school together, and Jennifer had thought they were destined to get married someday. But then, over a year earlier, Daniel had broken up with Jennifer and he'd started seeing someone else. But even after they'd broken up, Jennifer and Daniel remained friends. They had a lot in common, they liked spending time together, and they were both willing to give advice when the other one needed it. And recently, their text messages and occasional phone calls had gotten a little flirtatious, and so Jennifer thought there might be a chance that she and Daniel could get back together. So she laid in bed with her phone in her hand, looking at the last text she'd sent to Daniel, and wondering if she should send another one. But then, Jennifer heard the sound of the front door downstairs open and slam shut, and then Jennifer heard the sound of someone walking through the house. So, confused, Jennifer stood up, slipped her phone into the waistband of her yoga pants, and she walked over to her door, she opened it up, and she called downstairs to her mom to see what was going on. And then, Jennifer heard the sound of her mother screaming. So Jennifer rushed out into the hallway, but before Jennifer could do anything, she heard loud footsteps at the bottom of the stairs, and then suddenly she saw this huge man dressed in black running up the stairs towards her. Then Jennifer heard Bick shout something in Vietnamese, and she heard men yelling at her mother downstairs in English. Jennifer shouted to her mother again, but the man dressed in black was still coming up the stairs towards Jennifer, and when he made it all the way up the stairs, he grabbed Jennifer, raised a pistol to her face, and yelled, "Where's the money?" And then he pushed Jennifer back into her bedroom. When they were in the bedroom, the huge man in black shouted again at Jennifer, "Where's the money?" So Jennifer ran to her bedside table, she opened a drawer, grabbed an envelope, and took out $2,500 in cash, some of the money she had been saving from teaching her piano lessons. The man grabbed the cash from Jennifer and put it in his pocket. Then he took Jennifer roughly by the arm and led her back into the hallway. He brought her down the stairs and put her in the living room. Jennifer looked around, but she didn't see her mom or her dad anywhere. And then the man in black grabbed Jennifer and led her to the basement door. And when the door was opened up, Jennifer's heart started pounding because she could hear in the basement her mother and father yelling in a mix of Vietnamese and Cantonese, and Jennifer could tell they were scared and confused. The man with Jennifer told her to walk down into the basement, and with each step she took, the yelling from her parents got louder and louder. Jennifer finally reached the bottom of the stairs, and she saw her mom and dad on the basement couch, and she saw 2 more men dressed in black pointing guns at them. And the men kept screaming at Bick and Han, demanding to know where they kept all of their money. But Bick and Han were so scared, and they struggled to reply in English. And when they spoke, the men with guns didn't really understand them, and so they got angrier and angrier and just began yelling louder and louder at the parents. And so Jennifer, not knowing what else to do, just yelled in Vietnamese for her parents to please try to stay calm. And Han, when he heard this, he looked up from the couch and he saw his daughter at the bottom of the stairs. And at that point, he took a breath and he looked right at one of the gunmen. And in English, Han said, "Please don't hurt our daughter." And then that gunman who Han was speaking to turned to the man in black who had been leading Jennifer around and told him to take Jennifer back upstairs and keep looking for the money. So the big man in black led Jennifer back up the basement steps, and as Jennifer walked up to the first floor, she could hear her parents screaming again and the gunman just screaming right back at them. Once Jennifer and her captor were out of the basement, he led her from room to room on the first and second floors, and he had her pull drawers out of cabinets, throw mattresses off the beds, and basically tear the house apart looking for more money. But all Jennifer could find was about $1,000 in cash tucked away in Bick's bedside table, and she said she didn't know about any other money in the house. So, almost 20 minutes after the 3 intruders had first entered the house, Jennifer's captor walked her across the upstairs hallway, and when they reached the top of the stairs, he told her to get on the floor. Then he pulled 2 long black shoelaces out of his pocket, he crouched down and he grabbed one of Jennifer's arms and he tied it to a metal bar that supported the banister on the stairs. Then he took the other shoelace and tied her hands behind her back. Once the man was sure Jennifer was restrained, he left her there and he headed downstairs, and Jennifer heard the sound of the basement door open and slam shut again. Jennifer tried to stay as calm as she could, but she was borderline panicking. However, as she laid there, she felt that she could actually move her hands a little bit behind her back. So she took a deep breath and stretched her fingers out to feel her phone tucked into the waistband of her yoga pants. And she slowly pulled the phone out and held it in both of her bound hands, and she was able to crane her neck around just enough to see the keypad. But then the basement door flew open, and Jennifer heard the sound of footsteps running across the floor downstairs. And then she heard the front door open and close, and she thought she heard one of her parents screaming, and then the front door opening again. So Jennifer took another deep breath, she looked down at her phone, and she managed to punch in 911. And when the emergency operator picked up, Jennifer started yelling that people had broken into her house and she didn't know if her parents were okay and they needed to send help immediately. Minutes after this 911 call, Constable Mike Stesko of the Markham Police sped through the streets of the Pan family's quiet neighborhood with his sirens blaring. Stesko's rookie partner, Brian Derrick, was in the passenger seat, and the young man couldn't believe what was happening. He was shocked when they got the call that there had been a break-in nearby because breaking and entering, and most major crimes, were rare in this part of town. But over the years, the older cop, Stesko, had learned that dangerous people can be anywhere, even in nice neighborhoods with big houses and luxury cars parked in the garage. Stesko eased off the gas when he saw flashing lights from police cruisers and ambulances right outside of the Pan's house. He parked the car, and he and his rookie partner, Derek, stepped outside. And immediately, Stesko worried that they were dealing with something far worse than just a robbery, because Jennifer's father, Han, was lying on his driveway and blood was pouring down his face. Paramedics were already hovering over Han, so Stesko, Derek, and several other officers walked towards the front door. They had no idea if the robbers were still inside, so they all drew their weapons and quickly talked about doing a sweep of the house to look for the intruders. And then one of the officers opened the front door and they all rushed inside. And right away they heard the sound of a young woman screaming upstairs. Derek and a few other officers rushed upstairs past Jennifer. They searched all of the rooms to make sure no intruders were up there, and then when it was all clear, they came back to Jennifer. Derek cut Jennifer's hands loose, he helped her up, and then started walking her downstairs. And as they walked, all Jennifer kept asking was whether or not her parents were okay, but Derek didn't have an answer. Then Derek led Jennifer outside towards the paramedics, and at that point, Jennifer saw her father, Han, on a gurney being loaded into the back of an ambulance. And she yelled out, "Daddy, are you okay?" But Han didn't answer back. And the ambulance door shut, its sirens rang out, and Han was raced off to the nearest hospital. At this point, paramedics rushed over and surrounded Jennifer to see if she was injured, and they wanted to know if any of the intruders had assaulted her. And while Derek stayed with Jennifer outside as she talked to the paramedics, his partner, Constable Stesko, was inside the house still, following a trail of blood across the hardwood floors that led from the living room on the first floor to the basement door. The basement had not been cleared yet, so Stesko still had his weapon drawn. He opened the basement door and slowly descended the stairs, and he could hear each step creak under his feet as he moved deeper into the basement. And when Stesko got about halfway down the stairs, he could finally see into the small family room the Pans had set up in the basement, and his eyes went wide. He stopped, turned back to the open door, and yelled for paramedics. Then Stesko rushed down the rest of the steps into the center of that room, and he saw someone lying face down on the floor with a blood-soaked blanket covering their face and part of their back. Stesko yelled to this person to see if they might respond, but he knew it was no use. And seconds later, paramedics rushed in and they tried to revive the victim on the ground, but it was too late. Jennifer's mother, Bick, was dead on the basement floor. At 1:30 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, so over 3 hours after the home invasion had begun, Jennifer was sitting on a bed in a hospital room in Markham. Doctors had examined her and found that she was physically okay, but they had given her anxiety medication to help calm her down. The door to the room opened, and Jennifer looked up and saw Constable Derek, the rookie cop. He was young and handsome, and he had a nice smile, and he was Scottish and still spoke with a soft Scottish accent. Derek walked over to Jennifer and asked her if she was okay, and she said she was, but really all she wanted to talk about was her parents. Where were they? When could she see them? And Derek, as gently as he could, told her that her father had been airlifted to a trauma center in Toronto and that he was in a medically induced coma. An induced coma is used by doctors in some instances to help protect an injured person from suffering brain damage. Jennifer asked if her dad was going to be okay, but Derek said it was just too early to tell. Then she asked what happened to her mother, and Derek glanced at the floor for a second, and then he looked up at Jennifer, and he said he was so sorry, but her mother had been killed. Jennifer just stared at Derek for a long time, unable to speak. It was like she was so shocked by what she heard that she just froze. Then Derek broke the silence by telling her again how sorry he was, and he said he hated to put her through anything else, but he needed her to come to the police station right now to help police figure out what happened. And Jennifer, who clearly was in shock, just nodded her head and said she'd help any way she could. And so Derek helped Jennifer gather up her things, and he led her out of the hospital to a squad car, and as they drove through the dark, empty streets in the early hours of the morning, Jennifer just stared out the window. Suddenly, the town she had grown up in looked different, and she knew her life would now never be the same. At 2:45 a.m., so about an hour after Jennifer had left the hospital, Derek led her into a small interrogation room at the Markham police station and helped her into a chair at a wooden table that was pressed up against the wall. Derek walked across the room and took a seat. He was there just to observe, while a member of the York Regional Police conducted the actual interview. And the regional police officer knew how shaken Jennifer was, and so he reassured her that they were all just there to try to get as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Jennifer said she understood, and then she did her best to walk the officer through what she had seen in her house the previous night. She told him about the big man dressed in black, grabbing her, pulling her out of her room, dragging her down into the basement where her parents were, and then taking her back upstairs to look for money. Then she said the man had tied her to the banister, tied her wrists, but she still could move enough to get her phone and call 911. And she said when she was making that call, she heard what sounded like one of the intruders running across the first floor and running outside. And then right after that, she had heard the sound of someone screaming and also going out the front door. And she didn't realize it at the time, but now she thought that that second person, the screaming, must have been coming from her father, and he must have been trying to get out of the house because she knew police had found him in the driveway outside when they had arrived. The officer asked Jennifer if she could identify any of the men who had come into the house, but she said they were all dressed in black and their faces were covered, and they were all much bigger than she was. Then the officer leaned in a little closer to her and asked Jennifer what was her relationship like with Daniel Wong. And immediately, a confused look came across Jennifer's face, and she said she and Daniel had dated for years, but now they were just friends. The officer nodded and then asked her if she knew that Daniel was a drug dealer. And for a second, Jennifer just stared at him, and then she said, well, Daniel did sell a little marijuana when he was in college, but that's it. And sensing the direction that the police were taking this, Jennifer said again that, Daniel was just her friend and that there was no way he could have anything to do with anything like this. The officer scribbled some notes down in a small notepad and then quickly moved on to another line of questioning. And for the next 2 hours, he and Jennifer would talk through the night several times over, and by the end of the interview, all the police really knew was that they were looking for 3 tall young men. And despite what Jennifer might think about this, the police believed that her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, could absolutely be one of those 3 men. At 10 a.m., about 5 hours after Jennifer left the police station, she was pacing back and forth in a waiting room at a Toronto hospital. Jennifer's younger brother, who was a college student, had come back into town early that morning when he got the news about the attack on his family. And now he was sitting in a chair watching his sister walk back and forth while they both waited anxiously for any news about their dad. Jennifer had maybe dozed off for a few minutes earlier that morning, but she really hadn't slept in well over 24 hours. And so she felt jittery and she couldn't stop moving her hands and her mind felt foggy, but she told herself to stay awake and stay calm and just wait to hear any news about their dad. And then finally, a doctor walked into the room and Jennifer stopped pacing. The doctor had a very serious look on his face, and Jennifer and her brother kind of held their breath. But the doctor said things were looking good, and he believed their father, Han, would recover from his injuries. And after hearing that, Jennifer's brother got out of his chair, and he and his sister hugged. The doctor told them that they would need to be patient though, because Han was still in the induced coma, and it could be days before he came out of it. Jennifer and her brother said they totally understood, and they thanked the doctor for giving them the good news, and that they would wait to hear more. When the doctor walked out of the room, Jennifer and her brother just stood there in silence for about a minute. The news about their dad was very positive, but they both realized that focusing on their dad had given them an excuse not to think about what had happened to their mother. And now it was like suddenly it had hit them that Bic, their mother, was gone. And so after this long pause in total silence, Jennifer just looked over at her brother and said she was going to start making some calls to try to start arranging their mother's funeral. At 4 p.m. on November 10th, so 2 days after the fatal home invasion, Jennifer's ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, sat in a police interrogation room at the Markham police station. Daniel had black, spiky hair, and he wore glasses, jeans, and a black t-shirt. He sat across the table from a veteran Markham police detective, but Daniel didn't seem nervous or intimidated in any way. The veteran detective did not waste any time with small talk. Instead, he leaned in across the table and asked Daniel point blank about his history as a drug dealer. But Daniel didn't flinch. He admitted that he'd sold marijuana for years in college and that he had gotten busted on drug charges when he was younger. But now, he said, he had a good full-time job managing a pizza parlor and that he didn't deal any drugs anymore. Then the detective asked Daniel what his relationship was with Jennifer's parents, Bic and Han. Daniel, very calmly, told the detective that he always thought Jennifer's parents were strict when it came to Jennifer dating, that when she was younger, they really focused on her getting good grades and excelling in school. But then Daniel quickly added that in his own experience, and in the experience of a lot of his friends, Jennifer's parents weren't much different than most Asian immigrant parents. The veteran detective sat back in his chair and just stared at Daniel for a minute. He was a little taken aback by how calm and straightforward this young guy was being. So the detective finally asked if Daniel had any thoughts on who might have wanted to hurt Jennifer and her parents. And for the first time in the interview, Daniel hesitated. He looked down at the floor and shifted in his chair, so the detective leaned across the table again and asked what Daniel was keeping from him. And at this point, Daniel looked up and he said he might know something, but he had promised he would never talk about it. And the detective said he understood that, but he needed to know if Daniel had information that could lead police to the men who had broken into Jennifer's house. Daniel nodded, and in a quiet voice, he told the detective that months earlier, Jennifer had called him crying, and when he had asked her what was wrong, she said that a group of men had attacked her near her house, and they had raped her. The room went completely silent, and the detective just stared at Daniel. Then the detective said that Jennifer had not told police anything like that. But Daniel said he wasn't surprised, because Jennifer had never told anyone about it other than him, and she had sworn him to secrecy because she felt sort of ashamed about it. Following this interview with Daniel, the investigative team still looked at Daniel as a potential suspect, but they wanted to act fast on this possible new lead about this group of men previously attacking Jennifer and raping her. And they wanted to interview Jennifer again to see if she would corroborate what Daniel had just told them about this attack on her. So, on November 11th, 3 days after the home invasion, Jennifer returned to the police station. And while detectives followed up with her, other members of the investigative team returned to the scene of the crime. And as they walked through the Pan's house, they found a key piece of evidence that they had overlooked on the night of the actual attack. And that piece of evidence and information from Jennifer's second interview would put police on the trail of a new suspect. And then on November 12th, 4 days after the fatal home invasion, Jennifer's father, Han, came out of his medically induced coma. And when Han spoke to the police, he gave them information that proved they were already on the right track. And so eventually, Han's information would lead police to discover exactly what had happened on the night Bick was killed. Based on Han's information, evidence found at the scene of the crime, interviews, and cell phone data collected throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of the fatal home invasion, November 8th, 2010. At 10:15 p.m., 3 gunmen dressed in all black sat in a car parked in the shadows across the street from the Pan's house. Each of them held a pistol in their hand. One of the gunmen stared out the passenger side window at the Pan's house. He saw the TV was flickering in the living room window, and he saw one of the upstairs bedroom lights was on. The man took a deep breath and then looked at the other 2 men and told them it was time to move. Then all 3 gunmen got out of the car, they crouched down low and ran across the street, and one of them opened the Pan's front door, and all 3 rushed inside to the living room. Bick looked up from the TV, and the gunmen started yelling at her. Then one of them rushed her and grabbed her off the couch. The bowl she had been soaking her feet in fell over, and water spilled across the hardwood floor. Then one of the gunmen dragged Bick through the room and down into the basement. The other 2 gunmen ran upstairs and split up when they reached the second floor. One of the gunmen ran down the hall and threw open the door of the main bedroom where Han was sleeping, and the gunman screamed at him, "Where's the money?" And Han jolted upright in bed. But before he could figure out what was happening, the gunman had shoved a pistol into his face. Then the gunman grabbed Han by the arm, dragged him out of bed, and forced him downstairs into the basement with his wife. Once in the basement, the gunman threw Han onto the couch where Bick was already sitting and screaming, and the 2 gunmen who were in the basement with them yelled at Bick and Han more and more about wanting to know where their money was. Soon after that, the 3rd gunman came into the basement leading Jennifer, and Jennifer immediately yelled out to her parents to please try to calm down. And when her father, Han, saw his daughter, he began shouting at the gunman not to hurt her. Then the 3rd gunman took Jennifer out of the basement, while the other 2 gunmen stayed behind with Bick and Han. But Bick and Han continued to shout louder and louder at these 2 gunmen, pleading with them to spare them and to spare their daughter. And the 2 gunmen who were down there started to lose their confidence, like it would be really hard to shoot these 2 people who were begging for their lives right in front of them. So one of the gunmen walked across the room, grabbed a blanket off the arm of the couch, and threw it over Bick and Han's heads to kind of hide them from view to make it easier to be really aggressive and violent with them. And then that gunman stepped back across the room and joined his partner, aiming their guns at Bick and Han. But Bick and Han continued to scream out from under the blankets, asking them to please spare us, spare our daughter. And finally, the two gunmen just looked at each other, and then they both aimed their weapons, one at Bick and the other at Han, and they both fired. The first bullet ripped through the blanket and struck Han near the corner of his right eye. Under the blanket, Han felt blood streaming down his face and his head slumped over. A bullet from the other gun hit Bick in the neck, and blood spatter stained the inside of the blanket. Both gunmen fired again, and they both hit their victims in the shoulder, and under the blanket, Han and Bick stopped moving. But one of the gunmen walked back to the couch, raised his weapon to where Bick's head was under the blanket, and he fired one more time. This bullet struck Bick in the head and exited through the back of her skull, and she died on the basement couch right there. Upstairs on the second floor, the third gunman stood over Jennifer, who was tied to the banister. And when he heard those gunshots, he ran downstairs to the basement door, he opened it up, and began yelling for his partners to leave, and then he, the third gunman, who had been controlling Jennifer, ran outside. In the basement, the two gunmen looked at the bodies on the couch, and then they rushed up the basement steps. Neither of those two gunmen saw Han pull himself off the couch under the blanket and pull his wife's body out onto the floor with him. And they didn't hear Han as he got to his hands and knees and started making his way up the basement steps behind them. Because those two gunmen who had been in the basement were only focused on getting out of the house and back into their car. So they had bolted up the stairs of the basement into the living room, but they stopped when they heard shouting coming from behind them. And they turned around and saw Jennifer with her phone clutched in her bound hands at the top of the stairs. And then Jennifer said to them she would wait until she heard their car driving off before she called 911 to make sure they had a little extra time to get away. Jennifer Pan, the daughter who had once made Bick and Han so proud, had arranged for her parents to be murdered. Because it would turn out that Jennifer had been living a lie for almost 10 years and her parents had recently figured it out. Bick and Han had always believed Jennifer was a straight-A student who had gone on to excel in college. But the truth was, Jennifer had struggled with her grades and she never even graduated from high school. But when Jennifer had started to get bad grades in high school, she feared her perfectionist parents would ground her and keep her locked up in the house. And so she had started to forge her report cards to make it look like she was doing great in all of her classes. But as the lie went on, it had to get even bigger. So Jennifer had forged a high school diploma, and then she had forged an acceptance letter to a prestigious university and created a fake scholarship for herself that would mean her parents didn't have to pay for her college education. And so while her parents thought Jennifer was off at college being really successful, in reality she was just living with Daniel and making money teaching piano lessons. Because being a gifted piano player was maybe the only thing that Jennifer was not lying about. And Jennifer had used some of the money she had made teaching piano to buy college textbooks, and she marked the books up with fake notes and highlighted random passages so that when she was at her parents' house, she could show Bick and Han how hard she was working at school. Jennifer had gotten so good at lying that after another 4 years of living this totally fictitious life, she had convinced her parents that she graduated college with honors and with a degree that would allow her to become a pharmacist. And she even concocted an excuse as to why her parents couldn't come to her college graduation ceremony. But Jennifer's lie still had to keep going. So she had created fake ID badges and employment documents for a job that she didn't have. And she told her parents that she was moving in with a friend because her friend's apartment was right by where she worked. And so every day, Jennifer would hang out in cafes or spend time in the pizza parlor where Daniel worked, and then occasionally teach piano lessons to make some money, and then ultimately return back home to where she lived with Daniel. But all this lying finally came crashing down when Daniel had broken up with Jennifer, which meant she had to move out and back in with her parents. And as her father watched her leave for work every day, he started to get suspicious. Because Jennifer never seemed like she was in a rush to get out of the house, she never came home with work she had to get done, and she never wanted to meet for dinner or anything by where her job was located. And so one day, Han convinced Bick to follow Jennifer while he was at work, and Bick quickly discovered that Jennifer did not actually have a job. And soon after that, Bick and Han had confronted Jennifer, and Jennifer's years of lying started to unravel. And so, even though Jennifer was 24 years old, her parents told her that she was not allowed to leave the house without them, except to go teach piano. And they restricted her internet access, and they gave her an old flip phone that had limited text messaging capabilities, and Han checked that flip phone regularly to monitor who Jennifer was talking to. Han also made Jennifer take courses that would allow her to get her high school diploma, and then he made her enroll in a small local college program that would qualify her to become a pharmacist like she had pretended to be for years. And so, with all of these restrictions, Jennifer started to feel like she was a prisoner in the house she had grown up in, and she wanted out, and she wanted money. So she decided to kill her parents and get the large inheritance she knew would be coming from their deaths. Jennifer knew she didn't have the stomach to actually murder her parents herself, but she figured Daniel might know some people from his drug dealing days that might be willing to do it. But Daniel had broken up with Jennifer and kind of moved on, and so Jennifer needed to lure him back in. So one night she had called Daniel crying, and when he asked what was wrong, she lied again and told him that she had just been attacked and raped. And soon after that, Daniel and Jennifer started talking regularly again. And eventually, Jennifer offered Daniel money to find people to kill her parents. And so Daniel connected with an old drug buddy who said he'd do it, and that man brought in 2 more people to do the job with him. So Jennifer paid those 3 men to murder her parents, make it look like a robbery, and make it appear like Jennifer herself was a victim. She gave them a layout of the house, and she even unlocked the front door for them when she had gone downstairs into the living room to say goodnight to her mother, who was soaking her feet, on the night of the murder. And this bizarre, winding story started to become clear to the police when they went back to the scene of the crime. Because in Jennifer's room, they discovered that she had hidden a burner phone, which is a cheap prepaid phone people can use anonymously, that Daniel had bought for her. And on that burner phone, police found text messages between Jennifer, Daniel, and another man that sounded like they were planning a crime. And some of those text exchanges had taken place on the night of the murder. Then police discovered that Jennifer had called Daniel and the other man from the hospital where Han was to warn them that Han was going to recover. Finally, when Han came out of his medically induced coma, he told police what had happened in the basement. And he said when he cried out for the gunman not to hurt his daughter, he watched as his daughter leaned over and casually whispered something to the gunman who was supposedly her captor. And after that, Jennifer and this third gunman just began laughing together, and then they casually walked together up the basement steps to the first floor. And in that moment, Han realized his daughter had arranged for he and his wife's execution. Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, and 2 of the 3 gunmen were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. They were sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole, which was the maximum sentence they could receive for the crime in Canada. The 3rd gunman was sentenced to 18 years in prison. And after Jennifer's trial, her father Han released a statement. He said he missed his wife terribly, and he hoped his daughter Jennifer would still become an honest person someday. In early July of 2021, 71-year-old Thomas Trizona dragged a large inflatable raft across a sandy beach on the Colorado River. It was just before sunset, and he was sweaty and tired, but happy. It was the last day of a 2-week whitewater rafting trip in the Grand Canyon, and even though he desperately needed a hot shower, Thomas felt invigorated and youthful. Thomas was a retired surgical oncologist, which means he was a doctor who operated on people with cancer. He loved being a doctor and had always been a total workaholic. But after retiring earlier this year, he finally had time for himself. And one of the first things he had done was take this adventurous vacation with his wife Amy. Whitewater rafting had been as thrilling as he had hoped it would be. They'd floated past Native American ruins and through canyons with cliff walls stretching nearly a mile over their heads. They had seen eagles, condors, and bighorn sheep. Now, on the last night of the trip, Thomas and Amy secured the raft and joined the rest of their tour group around the campfire. Thomas's stomach growled as he watched their guide grill another delicious meal for them. Thomas looked forward to dinner and then one more night of stories around the fire. Tomorrow, it would be time to return home to Springfield, Oregon. But for now, Thomas just gazed up at the setting sun, knowing he'd cherish these memories forever. On July 16th, So a few days after returning home to Oregon, Thomas sat at his dining room table feeling bloated and nauseous. His wife, Amy, had prepared a beautiful dinner, but Thomas only pushed the food around on his plate. He told Amy that his upper abdomen really hurt. He'd started to feel sick shortly after getting home from their rafting trip, and he was now starting to lose weight. And this morning, it seemed like the pain had gotten even worse. It was now coming on in these big waves. Amy suggested that maybe he ate or drank something weird on their trip. Maybe he contracted a parasite. Thomas said he only drank the filtered water, and he didn't have diarrhea, which was a common symptom of parasite infections. And anyways, if he had picked up something on the trip, then Amy would probably have it too. But when he looked at Amy and asked her how she was feeling, she just kind of shook her head and said she didn't feel sick at all. Thomas knew that his wife was probably right, and his pains were no big deal. But as a retired doctor, Thomas couldn't resist diagnosing himself. Just in case it did turn out to be something serious that required him to see his physician, Thomas began keeping a detailed journal to record all of his symptoms. He thought that this journal would help him understand what was causing his pain. Thomas had seen some heart-wrenching cases in his long career as a cancer surgeon, and as he tracked his symptoms over the next few days, he started to get nervous. He wanted to stay open-minded about what was causing his symptoms, but he couldn't help gravitating toward the dreaded disease he knew so well: cancer. Thomas reminded Amy that his mother had died of pancreatic cancer when she was only 74. In his experience, a previously healthy 71-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain and unexplained weight loss could only mean one thing. Until he was proven wrong, Thomas was certain he had cancer too. Thomas picked up his cell phone and called his close friend, Jonathan Gonen. Dr. Gonen was a gastroenterologist, a doctor who specialized in the stomach and intestinal tract. Thomas told his friend that he wanted a CT scan to figure out if he had a tumor in his abdomen. But unfortunately, the earliest appointment Dr. Gonen could get for Thomas was a few weeks away in August. Thomas hung up the phone feeling disappointed. There was nothing he could do except wait. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror squeezing toothpaste onto his brush. And then he looked up and felt totally alarmed by his reflection. He was pale and gaunt, his weight was now down about 15 pounds since he'd returned from that rafting trip, and now he could barely stand from the fatigue he felt, let alone brush his teeth. Just then, a bout of nausea swept over Thomas, and he rushed to the toilet. He dropped to his knees preparing to vomit, but nothing came out. All of a sudden, he felt these severe spasms in his stomach as he fell over sideways onto the floor. The tiles were freezing cold against his cheek as he lay there shivering in just his boxers. Then he called out to his wife and said he needed to go to the emergency room right now. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat next to Amy in the emergency room's crowded waiting room. His blood had been drawn by a nurse, and he was waiting for the results. Thomas's phone pinged. He grabbed it and opened a message to find the results of his blood tests. All were normal except for one. He had elevated levels of a type of white blood cell called eosinophils. That, Thomas knew, could indicate three things: an allergy, a parasitic infection, or cancer. Thomas had already decided that he didn't have a parasitic infection, and he didn't think he had an allergy either. So that left only one possibility, the one he most suspected: cancer. Thomas asked the nurse at the reception area if he could speak directly with the doctor about the results. She told him that they had a long list of patients that day with serious problems that required immediate attention. Thomas could wait if he wanted, but it would likely be 4 or 5 hours until a doctor could see him. Thomas considered his options. He was pretty sure he did have cancer, but he knew he likely was not in any sort of immediate danger because of the cancer. And no matter what a doctor would say to him that day if he waited around to speak to one, it would still take way more testing to determine if he really had cancer or not. So Thomas stood up and told Amy they would just leave. He would deal with his cancer tomorrow. The next day, Thomas sat across the desk from his primary care physician. The doctor looked at the results on his computer as Thomas tried to describe his symptoms. And then at some point, the doctor asked Thomas about his diet and routines. And then after hearing what Thomas had to say, the doctor glanced up from the screen and told Thomas that, you know what, this is probably a dietary issue. And then he suggested Thomas try a grain-free diet. Thomas was stunned. He wanted to be screened for cancer. And now his primary physician was telling Thomas, a cancer specialist, to just try a grain-free diet? It seemed kind of asinine. And so Thomas just stood up and curtly thanked the doctor, and then took back the test results and left the building. 4 days later, Thomas was sitting at his dining room table with his laptop open in front of him when he got the best news he had received in a very long time. The results of the CT scan he'd finally been allowed to take had just come back. And the results were normal. He did not have cancer. Thomas felt an enormous wave of relief, but now he was more puzzled than ever. The pain in his abdomen had not gone away. He had barely eaten in the past 4 days, and he had now lost 22 pounds since he had returned from that rafting trip. And so Thomas was back to trying to figure out what was going on with him himself. And so while sitting at the dining room table, he began scanning through his journal with all of his symptoms he had recorded, while also going on his computer and looking up possible obscure disorders that might fit his symptoms. And as he clicked through these medical sites, he turned his attention to a chronic digestive disease in which white blood cells build up inside of the intestines, causing pain and bowel obstruction. Thomas knew that the condition, called eosinophilic gastroenteritis, was rare, but he was running out of ideas. He was growing desperate to know what was going on with him. He was in agony, both physically and mentally. And even though he was a doctor, he was completely stumped, and this made him feel so helpless. So eventually, Thomas just picked up his phone and called his friend, Dr. Gonin, to see if maybe he could help him again. A week later, Dr. Gonin paced inside of his office. He had just arranged to have Thomas have a tiny camera inserted down into his throat to look around inside of him to see if maybe he had a bowel obstruction. But like all of the other tests Thomas had undergone, this one too came back with normal results. Dr. Gonin was bewildered by his friend's case. He decided to order one more test to get a better look at Thomas's small intestine. The images on this specialized MRI would be much sharper than the CT scan, which would allow doctors to see very small problem spots. Dr. Gonin hoped the added clarity and details of the imaging would finally reveal what was wrong with his friend. The day after the MRI, Thomas went to the radiologist's office to discuss the results. Looking over the images, Thomas was surprised to see a tiny abnormality in his upper left abdomen. This abnormality was about 1 inch long and very, very thin. The radiologist told Thomas that the shiny spot looked more fuzzy on the earlier CT scan, and he thought it was just a buildup of plaque on Thomas's artery wall, which is a common sign of aging. But with the specialized MRI, it made it clear to the radiologist that he'd been wrong. Something strange was going on inside of Thomas's stomach. Then the radiologist had an idea. He was curious to see if this weird spot was stationary or moving around inside of Thomas, and so he offered to do another CT scan right then to find out. Thomas agreed, and they performed the scan immediately. And sure enough, it showed that the weird spot had moved in just a few weeks between one CT scan and the next. But before the two men could decide what to do about this weird, moving, skinny spot inside of Thomas's stomach, the radiologist noticed something else that required immediate attention. It might explain Thomas's chronic pain too. Thomas leaned in and saw on the image that there was another small spot. The doctor told Thomas that it was a gallstone, a hard mass that was growing in his gallbladder. Thomas and the radiologist stared at each other. Gallstones can cause severe pain and cause serious problems if left untreated. And so Thomas's inflamed gallbladder needed to be removed immediately. On September 13th, Thomas underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. In the last moments before the anesthesia knocked him out, Thomas prayed that he was about to be rid of the terrible stomach pains he had endured for 2 months. A few hours after the operation was over, Thomas lay in a hospital bed resting with Amy by his side. His surgeon entered the room, walked to Thomas's bedside, and stood there grinning. The surgeon said that he had successfully removed the gallstone and the inflamed gallbladder, but that was actually not what was making Thomas sick after all. The surgeon explained that while he had Thomas's abdomen open, he decided to investigate that tiny, thin spot, the trouble spot, from the MRI scans. And he found something he had never seen before in his entire career, something that totally explained all of Thomas's symptoms: his severe stomach pain, his nausea, his weight loss, and his constant fatigue. The surgeon pulled a small vial from his pocket and held it up for Thomas to see. It contained a small object about the size and shape of a needle. Thomas asked what it was, and the surgeon said he wasn't sure, but it was very sharp and it was inside of Thomas's intestines. And so no wonder he was in so much pain. From the looks of it, it was almost like Thomas had unintentionally swallowed a needle. Thomas leaned back in his bed, staring at this little thing inside of the vial. He couldn't believe that such a small object had caused so much misery, but he was obviously very relieved that the ordeal was now over. However, he knew he would not be able to rest easy until he figured out what this thing was that he swallowed and how he actually swallowed it. A few days later, Thomas took the object in the vial to a lab for analysis. The analyst found that it was a thin metal wire just under 1 inch long. What's more, they found a carbon pattern on the metal that exactly matched burned barbecue sauce. Thomas thought back to that last night on the Colorado River during the rafting trip and the delicious meal his guide had grilled for the whole group around the fire. That was the last grilled meat he had eaten before he started getting sick. Now everything was clear. The black metal object found in Thomas's intestine was likely a metal bristle from the brush his guide had used to clean the grates of the grill on that magical final evening of their trip. Thomas chuckled. He always knew that he would keep his memory of the Colorado trip for the rest of his life, but he didn't realize that he had also swallowed a little souvenir that would force him to remember. Here is our second story called Into the Woods. On a Saturday morning in June of 2009, a 55-year-old woman named Elizabeth and her husband Ron pulled their RV into a campsite in western Vermont. Elizabeth loved camping and took every chance she could to head for the wild, leaving behind her comfortable suburban life in Connecticut. But as she had gotten older, she had begun to enjoy the comfort of an RV. It was much nicer to sleep in a warm bed at night and not have to deal with the hassle of setting up a tent and then sleeping on the ground. The RV lifestyle was just so simple and so easy. Today, all the couple had to do was park their RV at the campsite, then put on some sunscreen, and then head out for their hike. And so, that's what they did. The dense Vermont forest they were in was beautiful, but Elizabeth had to admit that the conditions today were kind of miserable. The whole area was buzzing with these black flies that were swarming all over Elizabeth's legs and neck, and of course, Elizabeth had forgotten any bug spray. By the time she and Ron had got back to camp, every exposed part of her body was covered in bites, and over the next few hours, those bites turned into welts. Usually, whenever they went camping, Elizabeth and Ron really enjoyed lighting a campfire up at night and sitting out under the stars. But that evening, the black flies were so bad that they just stayed in the camper and played cards. Elizabeth and Ron were in good spirits, though. They'd camped in less than ideal conditions before, from freezing cold to pouring rain, and so they weren't about to let a few bug bites ruin their trip. But by the time Elizabeth changed for bed that night, her arms and legs were an unsightly mess. They didn't hurt, but all the red, swollen welts looked terrible. So she took a few ibuprofen to help with the swelling, and then she climbed into bed. The following day, Elizabeth and Ron got up and packed their bags and they headed home. And even though they had not enjoyed the black flies, they had had an overall nice time and felt energized from their weekend in the fresh mountain air. But for the rest of the week that they were home, Elizabeth battled this terrible on-again, off-again headache, and the welts from all those black fly bites were not going away. Elizabeth spent the following weekend at her niece's house in Long Island, New York. She was excited to catch up and spend some quality time with her family. But the whole time she was there, Elizabeth felt groggy, like she needed a strong cup of coffee. And then when she left and began driving back home, her headache came back full force to the point where it was just this constant, horrible throbbing pain against her temples. When she finally got home, she immediately took some ibuprofen to help with her headache, and then she drank as much water as her stomach would allow. She knew that black fly bites were not toxic, but her body seemed to be taking longer than usual to recover from them. That night, Elizabeth went to sleep early, hoping she'd wake up feeling better. But she didn't. She woke up in a cold sweat, and her stomach churned and her head pounded. She knew right away that she had a fever. Her husband, Ron, grabbed a thermometer from the bathroom, and sure enough, when he took her temperature, it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, Elizabeth was really starting to worry. She'd been sick now for more than a week, and she really didn't know how much longer this was going to last. And next weekend, she and Ron were hoping to go camping again in Vermont. They were going to meet up with Elizabeth's cousin and her cousin's husband. Elizabeth was really looking forward to the trip, but she was worried that her sickness, whatever it was, would force them to cancel. All week, Elizabeth tried to take care of herself. She stayed in bed, drank a lot of water, and ate well to help her body overcome this sickness. And finally, the morning before they were supposed to leave for Vermont, her fever broke. Throughout the day, she got better, and by that evening, she felt well enough to go camping. She was thrilled. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth got a good night's sleep, and the next morning, June 22nd, she and Ron loaded up the RV and headed back to Vermont. When Elizabeth and Ron arrived at the Winhall Brook camping ground, it was absolutely downpouring, which made it difficult to find their campsite and hook up their RV, but luckily, Elizabeth's cousin was already there and could help them get set up. When Elizabeth's cousin made a joke about the great weather they were having, Elizabeth thought about her last camping trip in Vermont and decided that she actually preferred this monsoon over swarms of black flies. Elizabeth invited her cousin and her cousin's husband into their RV, planning to cook some dinner while they waited for the rain to subside. But several hours later, the rain still had not let up, and so Elizabeth's cousin and her husband ran back to their own RV, and Elizabeth and Ron, they climbed into bed and they went to sleep, hoping that when they got up, the weather would clear and they could actually go outside and enjoy the outdoors. But the next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, the rain was not remotely on her mind. Instead, she had this blinding headache, and she also knew immediately that her fever was back. Her skin was itching and her eyes felt red. Her mouth felt gritty, almost like it was covered in little bumps. Elizabeth was annoyed, knowing she was likely going to be sick all day and could not participate in anything they were going to do. Elizabeth rubbed her eyes and slowly made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth. She debated whether she should just ask Ron to take her home, or if she could tough it out in the RV so he could at least still enjoy the vacation. Once in the bathroom, Elizabeth spit out the toothpaste into the sink, and she noticed her spit was bright pink. And when she rinsed her mouth, she tasted blood. She opened her mouth and stuck her tongue out, and her eyes widened as she realized the bumps that she had felt inside of her mouth were these black blood blisters all along her tongue and on the inside of her cheek. Elizabeth started to feel panic rising in her chest, and so she hurried out of the bathroom and over to her cousin's RV. Luckily, her cousin's husband was actually a doctor, and so he had Elizabeth stand in their kitchenette while he looked around the inside of her mouth with a flashlight. And after a minute, he turned off the light and just shook his head. He said he had never seen a condition like this before, and he urged her to go to the hospital. Within minutes, the RV was packed up and Ron was sitting behind the wheel. Elizabeth needed to use the bathroom before they headed off, but when she urinated, it burned. Now Elizabeth was truly worried. These were not flu symptoms. Elizabeth made her way to the passenger seat up front, sitting beside Ron. By this time, her headache was back and worse than ever. She popped an ibuprofen as they pulled out of the campground, but nothing took the edge off the pain in her head or the itching that had developed all over her body. It took 2 hours of driving down winding country roads to get to the nearest emergency room in Brattleboro, Vermont. To Elizabeth, every single time they hit a bump in the road, it made her nauseous with pain. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth was in pure agony. Ron parked the RV, then walked around to the passenger door to help Elizabeth get out. When she saw him, she smiled at him, but she could see his eyes were full of fear. It wasn't until she herself looked in the rearview mirror and saw her reflection that she understood why. Her face was so swollen that she almost didn't recognize herself. About 5 hours later, Dr. Teresa Fitzharris walked into her office at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, ready to start her overnight shift. She put her purse under her desk, then went to check on Elizabeth, who was her first patient of the night. When Dr. Fitzharris walked into Elizabeth's hospital room and looked at Elizabeth, the doctor tried to hide her shock. Elizabeth's throat, chest, torso, and entire back were covered in a bumpy red rash. Dr. Fitzharris played it cool, but she'd never seen a rash this bad before. Elizabeth also had a fever of 101.6. Her heartbeat was also elevated, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them. Dr. Fitzharris sat down next to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth began to recount the last 2 weeks of sickness and misery and all the symptoms she'd experienced since getting bit by all those black flies. Dr. Fitzharris pulled 2 rubber gloves out of a cardboard box in the storage cupboard. She put them on, then gently ran her hand down Elizabeth's arms and back. And as she did this, she frowned. She was confident that this was actually not the result of black fly bites. But Dr. Fitzharris couldn't think of any other condition that would cause a rash like this. And until she could figure it out, Elizabeth was very likely to continue to get worse. At a minimum, the rash could cause serious, lasting damage to Elizabeth's skin. Her eyes could be damaged as well, and there was no telling what this mystery condition could be doing to the inside of Elizabeth's body. Dr. Fitzharris didn't really know where to start with Elizabeth, so she just ordered some x-rays and blood work, and then went to go check on a few other patients while she waited for those things to happen. A little over an hour later, after Elizabeth had gotten the x-ray and done the blood work, Dr. Fitzharris looked over the results on the computer in her office. And to her surprise, Elizabeth's blood work and her x-rays had come back totally normal. And so Dr. Fitzharris was stumped. So she picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, Dr. David Albright, the infectious disease doctor who was on call that night. She walked Dr. Albright through Elizabeth's symptoms, and she could hear him scribbling notes down as she spoke. And then after Dr. Fitzharris was done talking, Dr. Albright let out a long sigh. He said that most sudden fevers, like the one Elizabeth had, were caused by viral or bacterial infections, and so the problem now was figuring out which one of those she'd contracted. Because Elizabeth had been spending so much time outdoors, Dr. Albright guessed that she might have an insect-borne illness like Lyme disease or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Dr. Albright told Dr. Fitzharris that he'd be in the next morning, and he promised to make Elizabeth his first stop. In the meantime, Dr. Fitzharris decided to put Elizabeth on antibiotics just in case she did have an insect-borne illness. If left untreated, conditions like Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis can cause organ failure. The doctor just hoped that she hadn't acted too late. Early the following morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of a knock at the door of her hospital room. She squinted through her swollen red eyes and saw the blurry outline of a person walking into the room. He then introduced himself as Dr. Albright and asked if the medicine that Dr. Fitzharris had prescribed was helping at all. Elizabeth groaned and shook her head no. She told Dr. Albright that she could barely see and her rash was more painful than ever, to the point where even a tiny shift in bed was extremely painful. He promised he would do everything he could to help her, and then he said he was very sorry, but he needed Elizabeth right now to sit up straight so he could determine how much her rash had spread. And so Elizabeth tried not to scream as Dr. Albright helped her sit up. Even the slightest touch on her skin was agonizing. As Dr. Albright looked over Elizabeth's body, he could see that the rash had spread, and it did not look like the medicine had helped at all. That meant his suspicion that it might be something like Lyme disease was incorrect. But unfortunately, he didn't really have any idea what else could be making her sick. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as Dr. Albright helped her lie back down. She knew the doctors were doing their best, but the fact that basically nothing had worked so far was still extremely frustrating. She could barely open her eyes and her whole body felt like it was on fire. About an hour later, Dr. Albright reappeared in Elizabeth's doorway. This time, Elizabeth could make out a second figure standing next to Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright explained that he'd brought a colleague with him who was a dermatologist, or a skin doctor, and his name was Dr. Jorge Crespo. Dr. Albright wanted Dr. Crespo to take a closer look at Elizabeth's rash. He hoped that if they could determine what kind of reaction this was, it might inform them what was actually making her sick. Elizabeth braced herself for pain as the doctors once again helped her sit up so Dr. Crespo could look at her. He spent a few moments examining Elizabeth's rash, checking her eyes and the inside of her mouth. Then Elizabeth saw him nod to Dr. Albright, as if to confirm a suspicion. He told Elizabeth that she had a rare but severe kind of allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Dr. Crespo explained that she'd ingested something that triggered an incredibly violent response from her immune system. Her body was so desperate to get the allergen out of her system, it attacked the deepest layers of her skin, causing the blistering rash that now covered her whole body. Soon, he believed, the top layer of her skin would start peeling off. It would look worse before it felt better, almost like she'd suffered a severe burn. None of what the doctor was saying made any sense to Elizabeth. She assured Dr. Crespo that she hadn't ingested anything unusual over the past 2 weeks. She told him again about the black fly bites and wondered if maybe any of the flies could have been carrying some kind of bacteria or virus or fungus that could have infected her. But Dr. Crespo just shook his head no. What made Stevens-Johnson syndrome very unique was not only the reaction, but the thing that caused it: medicine. For reasons doctors do not fully understand, medicines that normally improve people's health can sometimes trigger this life-threatening allergic reaction in certain patients. In Elizabeth's case, Dr. Crespo was confident that the cause was one of the most common, easy-to-get, over-the-counter medicines on the entire planet: ibuprofen. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. She'd been taking ibuprofen steadily for the last 2 weeks to reduce the swelling from all the black fly bites and to alleviate her headaches. Little did she know, the medicine was causing all of these problems. But something didn't make sense to her. She told Dr. Crespo that she'd been taking ibuprofen for as long as she could remember. If she was allergic to it, then why hadn't this happened before? Why didn't she have a big reaction the first time she took it? Dr. Crespo shrugged. He admitted that he really didn't know why Elizabeth would develop this allergic reaction so late in life. Stevens-Johnson syndrome was so rare that the root cause of it was actually still unknown. But at least Elizabeth knew now that she could not take ibuprofen, and Dr. Crespo assured her that if she stopped taking it, that she would recover in about a week or maybe 2. Elizabeth was given steroids to help reduce her symptoms, and a few weeks later, she had recovered enough to go home, just like Dr. Crespo promised. But because her allergic reaction had gone untreated for 2 weeks, some lasting damage had already been done. Elizabeth's eyes had swelled so badly that her tear ducts were permanently damaged and no longer worked. Ever since, she's had to administer saline drops in her eyes every few minutes to keep them working properly. But Elizabeth likes to look on the bright side and has said at least she can still see. On the night of October 20th, 2021, 2 young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé Chris, and their friends Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. So, North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. After all, their professional football team is named the Carolina Panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County in recent days. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his and Rachel's new puppy. He swore the panther had been following him in the tree line around his property, and he had been afraid it was thinking about attacking his dog. Ever since, he told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. Jake and Chris got up off the couch and walked into the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. And so she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now, obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, with this panther roaming around, but he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun. So he said he would go. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute." He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddy's back. The two guys said they'd be back in a minute, and then they walked out the door. A light wind rustled the leaves of the trees as Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their two homes. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. But all they could hear was the wind, some crickets, and an owl hooting in the distance. But about halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods and instinctively shot out his hand to stop Jake in his tracks. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. And for a second, all they saw were green leaves. But then, two eyes opened up and reflected back at them. The two men gasped and instinctively reached for their guns, but before they had to draw and do anything, this creature emerged from the underbrush, and it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, as Chris and Jake walked along this dark path, something just felt different. The crickets seemed to have gotten quieter and the wind had picked up. The owl that had been hooting before must have flown away because it was now strangely quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the trees. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon, because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods, but it didn't. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was gonna leap out. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises, the snapped twig, the stifled laughter, which sort of resembled a short raspy growl, and the shaking bushes, signaled to the guys that this was no prank. This was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns and they began to shoot until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally. And so no one was ever charged with Rachel's death. And to this day, no one has ever gotten solid evidence that that Black Panther even exists. Our next story is called Call Your Mother. On the morning of September 15th, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfenson shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of her brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her table and her foot caught a basket of newspapers in the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it, and she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life. For like 20 years, she had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life, by choice. And basically the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason, 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything, and then she never heard from him again. And so suddenly losing her son for reasons unknown sent Rita into this spiraling depression, and the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house, totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help, and nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble, she's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's going to survive this, she has to save herself. And so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low-crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there. The whole time she's got this horrible pain on her side. She gets to the table, she reaches up, and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls, but she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, and she dialed 911. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house, they come in, they find Rita, she's still on the ground, they scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirmed, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery, but then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone, and you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she'd spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son. And that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left because she was so holding on to his memory. And so after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do, and it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. So she grabbed the phone, and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph, and so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years, but immediately the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister, before, Louis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life, Joseph and his older sister had been very close, and it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. I mean, he felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her, he was ready to hear whatever she had to say because obviously something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're going to get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. And so she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house and it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home. And so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door. She opened it up and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of, plates of food and all this stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting, and so her house really smelled horrible. Not to mention, Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years. And so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation, but this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita, and so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell, and so she stepped into the house, which again, is piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk, and so she began walking through the house, and she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs. She went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff, and she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's, so she just went to the first door that she saw, and she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house, practically screaming, and then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Louis inexplicably leaving, the event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off, her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out, and that's why he had just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Louis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her, but 20 years earlier, when Louis was 29 years old, while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about, and it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into this spiraling depression and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Louis had never left her house. He was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Louis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased, and that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Red Ghost. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now for Sarah, this was really alarming, because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise, so clearly something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up, and on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person, and so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade, and Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil. The devil's come back, and so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet, no idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns, and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure, but quickly as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth, and so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth.
And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened here, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claim to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. The Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was, but for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died, and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the Red Ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite.
Pieces of the night are scattered like a puzzle left in tatters, but I hear your rhythm call, pulling patterns through it all. Little fragments start aligning, colors shifting, redesigning. Every beat you give to me, symphony. Your heartbeat pulsating,
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.